Qigong versus Neigong. That is going to be the topic of this episode of Chi Life. So when people first start learning Qigong, and maybe they start looking at some different practices and they start looking at different resources, they have lots of enthusiasm and curiosity, which is fantastic. And quickly they'll encounter there's all these new and unusual words, unfamiliar words in a different language to start to figure out what they mean. And as well as this, there's different teachers teaching things from quite different perspectives and with different focuses on different things. And sometimes this can lead to a bit of a misunderstanding about what different words mean. And the topic of this video is going to be on one that is quite common. You know, it comes up from time to time and I see people talking about it, and it can be a little bit, for me, it reminds me a little bit of, maybe you've watched the movie The Princess Bride, and there's this self-proclaimed genius who, I think his name is Vizzini, something like that. And you know, they're embarking on this adventure, and this self-proclaimed genius, he has a catch word that he says a lot in different circumstances, and he often says things are inconceivable, often after something has just already happened, which kind of means, well, by definition it must be conceivable because it's happened, you know. And there's the swordsman there who's called Inigo Montoya, who has a couple of great lines, well, a whole range of great lines in that movie. And one of the times after Vizzini has just said inconceivable again, he says, "That word you keep saying, I do not think it means what you think it means." And this can be the case with, well, lots of terms in Qigong. And I think a lot of this comes from, yeah, again, people with curiosity and enthusiasm and you know, just finding their way and looking at different resources and maybe not with enough full perspective yet, which of course is fine. It's a learning process. But as you continue down your path, can maybe be a little bit problematic if you get fixed on a meaning of a word which isn't quite accurate, and that can divert you from really understanding what different people are talking about and the nature of different practices and things like that. So in this vlog, I don't know, it's probably going to be a little bit rambly. I'll talk about a few different things about different terms. So I'm going to talk specifically about Qigong and Neigong, because these are two that come up, you know, this is, you know, an example of this sort of concept, and it comes up, and I'll clarify a bit about those. But as part of that, I'll talk about some other terms as well, and a little bit of history, and, you know, to put things into context. So another thing, actually, you know, while we're talking in this area, another thing that's sometimes misunderstood, and this is by people who sometimes go a little bit beyond the very surface, and they do start to do a little bit of research, but maybe the research that they do, they get a little bit of a misunderstanding from. And sometimes come across people saying like, oh, Qigong, that's, you know, only relatively recent, like it's kind of a not all that ancient practice, you know, still old, but not all that ancient. And this is another misunderstanding. What they're referring to is that the use of the word Qigong as an umbrella term for all of the different types of practices where we work with our mind, our body, our breath to work with our energy, as a phrase or a word to cover and include all the practices that work in that way. Qigong only became popular as a term to include all of those practices relatively recently, and by relatively recently I don't actually recall when it was, but it's like, you know, it's not thousands of years ago. it's more recent than that. But that's not to say that the practices themselves aren't ancient, and in fact that the term Qigong isn't significantly older than that as well. There are references specifically to Qigong, written references that go back, well, a lot longer ago than when it became a common and popular umbrella term for all of these practices. It's just, it was, it appeared from time to time as a term rather than, as this word that's just used to embrace all those practices. And there's archaeological evidence of Qigong going back to between 5,000 and 8,000 years. So the practices themselves are really, really, really ancient. And of course, they've changed and developed over time, but the roots of the practices are really, really ancient. The term Qigong itself is also really quite ancient. But more recently is when it started to be used as a term to cover all of these many practices where we work with our mind, our body, our breath, as a way to work with our energy. Before that time, what happened was, the practices were already there, but there were lots of different names given to different types of practice. So for example, one name was Tu Na, which basically means exhaling and inhaling. So breathing exercises. And so people, instead of necessarily saying Qigong, and as they're doing that, referring to breathing exercises that work with their energy, they'd say Tu Na. They'd refer specifically to breathing exercises. Similarly, another, quite old term is Daoyin, which means leading and transferring, so moving the energy, essentially moving energy through the body. So that was another term that was given to different types of practice. Another term was Enqiao, which basically means massage. So different techniques where we use massaging to stimulate the energy. Another one, Jingzhuo, which is sitting meditation, right? And people tend to refer to it as a separate practice, sitting meditation. Whereas now it's common to refer to different types of meditative practices, sitting practices as a type of Qigong. And you might say, Qigong meditation or sitting meditation Qigong or something, but it fits under this umbrella. Previously, it might have been more referred to just by itself. Another old term used for different types of practices that now collectively just get called Qigong was Xingqi, which means to circulate qi, circulate energy. Often specifically referring to circulating that qi or energy within the meridians. So there are all these different terms referring to different types of practices, and over time people sort of realized, and they thought about it, it's like, these are all kind of just different variations of methods working on the same thing or in the same broad area, that is working with our qi, working with our energy. So they started to call them all collectively Qigong. Qigong, broad term to describe all of those. And again, still you might say, yes, Qigong, and then refer to a specific type of Qigong practice, because there's lots of different specific types of Qigong practice. But yeah, that occurred relatively recently, as in not thousands of years ago. But yeah, the practices themselves are very ancient, and it's just that terminology changed. Now, referring to Neigong as an extension of this, sometimes I find dealing with different people, and they, I guess it's often when they're quite fresh to Qigong practice or other practices of this type, and they're doing something like, yeah, I'm doing Neigong, or they're doing some kind of Qigong practice and like, I want to do some Neigong, and there's kind of, it seems, some implication in their mind that Neigong is something completely different, like it's a different thing from Qigong, which it's really not. Again, it's just a distinction in terms. So Qi means energy, Gong means work or skill. So quite simply, working with our energy, developing skill with our energy, Qigong. Nei Gong, Nei means internal, Gong means work or skill. So same sort of idea, working internally, developing skill internally. And most commonly, this is referring to working with your energy internally. And so again, it's a particular focus of a type of Qigong practice, where you're focusing internally on working with your energy, which many things that we refer to as Qigong are, well, yeah, you could say they're a type of Neigong. So the contrast to this, so Nei is internal, Y is external. So you might have Neigong, internal skill, the contrast to that is Weigong, external skill. And so that would be focusing more on an external development of skill. And again, there are Qigong practices that work on developing skill to be used more externally. So they're both relevant, but it's this just distinction in terms. Is the focus more internal versus is the focus more external? Some other terms that relate to this that commonly come up at different points. So another term is dan. So as in or dan or dan. So as in dantien, so that dan refers to like elixir. So it's like something very valuable, which creates vitality within us. And so two, again, contrasting terms are Neidan and Waidan. So an internal elixir or an external elixir. So an external elixir would be something that you use externally to create health and vitality. So like a medicine or a herbal concoction of some sort that might be taken. So something external taken into the body, an external elixir to bring vitality. Whereas Neidan is internal elixir, where you develop that vitality within, which of course, Qigong is one of the primary ways we do this in its many variations, whether that be sitting meditation, whether that be moving practices, whether it be breathing exercises, whatever it is, these are all actually internal methods overall, and that we're creating that elixir, that health-giving energy within ourselves rather than taking something external in to create that health and vitality. So yeah, hopefully this is helpful maybe for some of you who are starting to dig a little bit below a very superficial sort of exploration of Qigong, to just clarify a bit what some of these terms are referring to. Qigong, very broad term. It's used very broadly in our modern age to describe all of these practices. And then sometimes there are these other terms that refer to a particular type of focus within the practice. So a Neigong practice, generally there's an implication that it is going to be a bit more subtle in the way that it's internal. So, again, in many ways you could describe any Qigong practice as being a Neigong, because we're creating energy within ourselves rather than relying on things external so much. But generally the way it's used is there's an implication that maybe there's not going to be so much external movement. It's going to be more about using the awareness, using the intention to create more subtle changes internally, which of course can be very, very powerful. And so it's a category distinction rather than something very different in itself, like completely different. Qigong's one thing, Neigong's something else. It's more a category distinction for the type of practice and the type of quality of the practice. So anyway, I hope that's useful. Some people will probably maybe have some different ideas about some of the, the exact definitions of these words or so on. We don't need to be too exact. The words are quite clear in themselves and their overall meaning. It's really how people apply that. They might get like, well, specifically they're referring to this. That's okay. It doesn't mean the word only refers to that. The word might have a much broader meaning, but they tend to use it in a very specific way. And yeah, understanding these words, it can make it more clear when you're looking at different practices and the way people describe them, or you're reading different things, you can understand a little bit more of what it is that you're dealing with. If you're relatively new in your Qigong journey, it's really helpful to get the landscape of what's out there in terms of Qigong, to start to orient yourself and start to understand, what it is that you might see, what it is that you might experience, and that can help guide you towards the things that you're most interested in and the things that you find most valuable. We do have, so on the Long White Cloud Qigong website, we do have, I think it's a pretty good resource. It's the Introduction to Qigong Theory and Practice course. It's a free course. And in that course, it goes through, we don't actually talk about Qigong versus Neigong or things like that. That's why I've made this vlog something very, very specific. But it's a course where, to give you like a very broad overview of Qigong, where it's come from, what it is, the different types of tools used in Qigong, so how the mind, the body, and the breath are used in Qigong, and there's some practical exercises in there to help you to gain a little bit of experience for yourself and appreciate how the mind, the body, and the breath work together to work with our energy, and and then some basic Qigong practices just to give you a little bit of a starting point, as well as this broad context, history of Qigong, how it's been applied historically. A little bit of an overview of the many different types of Qigong that there are out there. And yeah, I think it's a great resource for just giving yourself a broad overview, which you can then use to direct yourself towards what it is that you'd most like to get from your Qigong practice, maybe to finding the specific types of Qigong practice that are going to be most useful for you. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this vlog. Maybe, hopefully not too long, not too rambly. If you have liked the vlog, please like, comment, subscribe, share, all these good things. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you on the next one.